Welcome everyone to the ISM Rochester March Lunch and Learn webinar. Today, our speaker will be Tom Cook, the CEO, Managing Director of Blue Tiger International, and he will be speaking on managing successful negotiations with vendors and suppliers. Please be sure to ask questions using our chat or our Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, as we would like this to be an interactive session. Tom was the former CEO of American River International in New York and Apex Global Logistics Supply Chain Operation in Los Angeles. He has over 30 years of experience in assisting companies all over the world to manage their import and export operations. He is a member of the New York District Export Council, sits on the board of numerous corporations, is also the director of the National Institute of World Trade, a 30-year-old educational training organization based on Long Island. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Tom.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Kathy always does a great job of organizing these events and making them come off real smooth. And we, both sides as instructors and also as participants, appreciate that effort. Also, I'd like to send thanks to Lindsay Dinney from my office for helping arrange put this event together. So I've spoken before the Rochester group over the past year and a half. So I hope some of you know who I am. I'm a consultant on global supply chain. The practice goes back over 30 years. We focus on helping companies reduce risk and spend in their supply chain, particularly those companies that are involved with an international footprint. I'm going to spend the first few moments of the presentation on kind of framing the discussion. I'm going to share with you a lot of the views that I have just overall in how I navigate the responsibility of managing vendors and suppliers. As a consultant, we help companies manage their relationships, but we're also heavily involved in helping them negotiate contracts and deals. We have probably maybe as many as 55 to 60 contracts with companies that when they get to certain spend levels, they come to us to help them negotiate through an RFP or negotiate with a what would be considered a tier one or critical supplier. And I have a group of people on my staff that do that on a full-time basis for various companies. So we're actually very involved in choosing vendors and suppliers and managing those relationships. We're going to get into points of vendor sustainability, factors impacting vendor relationships, actual negotiating thought process with vendors, spend some time managing RFPs. RFPs is actually a whole discussion that can be put together for a whole hour time frame. So we're just going to touch on some key points. And then I'm going to close with the best practice. As Kathy mentioned, at any point in time, feel free to raise your hand up in the chat and ask a question. The more interactive we make the event, then the more successful it will be. So coming back to this issue of framing the discussion, I hold that people in procurement and in supply chain have three primary responsibilities as it relates to vendors and suppliers. One is sourcing, finding out which ones are out there that could be provide potential value and benefit to your organization. Once you have found and vetted those companies from the sourcing perspective, purchasing is actually creating the deal and the transaction and bringing that company into your organization. Vendor management is more of the sustainability side of trying to maintain the relationship with that vendor and creating high levels of performance, accuracy, quality control, and things like that with that vendor over a period of time. I hold to the concept that having longer term vendor relationships works to the benefit of both parties rather than having to switch vendors in a particular purchase or spend on a very often basis. So one of the things that we strongly believe in is the tiering of suppliers. It helps us with our time and operational management functions, mainly because most of us have so many responsibilities associated with purchasing and supply chain that you can't possibly manage every spend that the company is making just because of the time element that's involved. So what we try to do is to create a tier one type supply level, which is ranked by spend amount and or the importance of that purchase into your operation. And the question is, where do you spend your time and effort? If your company's average spend is $150,000, they want you spending, your time on purchases that are in excess of $150,000. If you have a $10,000 expense that is pretty irrelevant to your organization, you really shouldn't be spending the kind of time as compared to where you had $1 million spent in any one category. So the idea is that thinking of it as tiering your suppliers helps us manage better and getting better results for our efforts. What we do in trying to determine how companies fall into that tier one capacity is we head into accounting. And 99% of the time, the rule of thumb that 80% of your spend is in 20% of your suppliers. So that's where the focus of effort's going to be in really trying to create sustainable long-term relationships with vendors and suppliers. Outside of the spend is also critical suppliers, because you might have a low level of spend with a particular supplier or vendor, but the purchase of that product or service may be extremely critical in your supply chain. And therefore, that would also move into that tier one category. Once you identify that tier one supplier and express the fact that that's where your focus is going to be from a management standpoint, that needs to be supported by senior management. So there's no expectation that if something at a $10,000 level of spend falls between the cracks, there's no consequence because you're spending your time on spends that are much greater than that. Also, as part of our responsibilities in creating sustainable relations with vendors and finding vendors, sourcing, purchasing, and vendor management, is we have to make decisions all the time. And another subject that we have our presentation for, something maybe to consider for your organization, is one on the decision-making process and basically how to make better decisions. And one of the aspects that we focus on, and is very important to people in vendor management and supply chain, is to understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative in the decision-making process. Quantitative is using metrics and science, data-driven algorithms, meaning we're collecting facts and data that supports the decision that we're trying to make. As compared to qualitative, which is more our feelings, our sensibilities, our mindset, our experience, and our judgments. I appreciate the fact that the more seasoned and matured an individual is in procurement and supply chain, they're more likely to have a higher focus on qualitative over quantitative. People with less experience and less maturity in the process of purchasing and vendor management really need to depend more on the quantitative side. I always point out that at the end of the day, one of the things that we think about when comparing qualitative and quantitative is how senior management would respond to that, meaning that senior management really wants decisions made upon metrics and hard data as the governing energy that's used in making that kind of decision. One of the things that we have in vendor management that we need to be very conscious of is the concept of making sure that we're fighting complacency, particularly in good relationships. And there's just a general tendency that when a relationship is going well, we tend to put down our defenses and things just kind of move along. And when that happens, complacency occurs.
Hey, Tom, there's one person has their hand up. So let me,
Sure.
Wanda, would you like to talk and ask your question?
I apologize. I hit that by accident.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
No problem, Wanda, that's 25 push-ups. We'll just take you on good faith. You're going to do that. So complacency is one issue that we deal with. Two is vendor losing money. We never want to be in a situation where we're squeezing a vendor over price, okay, where they end up agreeing to the contract, but they're going to actually lose money in the transaction and the deal. The reason that we get concerned about that is because if they're going to lose money, it's likely they're going to try to make it up somewhere else in the agreement. So it might be cutting services, it might be cutting quality, it might be covering delivery and cutting delivery times. There's some aspect to be lost. So in our vendor management, we're always asking the question of the vendor as we have various quarterly business meetings and reviews and so forth like that. We always have the conversation, how are you doing relative to our account in terms of profitability? They appreciate it as a vendor that we're concerned about that, okay? And it makes for a better working relationship or partnership with that vendor. You want to minimize animosity because animosity causes people to react on a personal level. And generally when things react on a personal level, you then have bad decisions being made, which ties into the fact of not taking it personally in the relationship that you have with a vendor or supplier. And irresponsible behavior on both sides, either you on the purchasing and vendor side, purchasing or sourcing side, or on their side as the company servicing you. We additionally want to have a level of empathy, understanding and taking the time to communicate in two directions with the supplier is another critical part of vendor management. That's asking the questions that are important to them. I'll make a point in a little while as we get into this discussion that the concern about the vendor and what's important to the vendor and what the vendor needs in order to be able to perform and do their job is as critical an aspect as them trying to find out from you what you need in them servicing your business. I like to think of vendor management as very similar to project management. Not sure how many of you may have taken project management classes, but I always make the recommendation to people who are in management roles or operational roles in companies, particularly those in the supply chain, that a project management class is actually something to consider taking because it really helps you organize yourself, prioritize correctly, and at the end of the day, get better results in the relationship that you have with the supplier and vendor, as well as your management team that sits above you. So in project management, like in vendor management, we must clearly set expectations and deliverables. We must align all the corporate stakeholders. We always keep in mind that in vendor management, okay, in purchasing, procurement, and sourcing, we're an extension of our internal stakeholders in the company, servicing them and providing them with the services that they require or the products that they need to operate their responsibilities. So aligning those corporate stakeholders is very critical, in terms of managing our vendor and supplier responsibilities. We strongly believe in open communication, both timely and comprehensively, and that's been a factor relative to COVID that has made it very critical within companies that they communicate much more timely and much more comprehensively since COVID has been impactful for the last 2 years. The ability to curate strategies on how we're going to approach any relationship with a vendor or supplier, and particularly as we approach a negotiation with them for a renewal or when we are going to bring in new vendors. Tactics, the actual actions that we're going to take to make things happen. To also create an implementation strategy that once we're going to bring a vendor in, okay, particularly a new one, or renew a relationship with an existing vendor, that we have a time frame allowed for implementation for whatever changes need to be made. And then a system for updates and follow-ups. In a new relationship, that might be on a weekly basis. Okay, on a more matured relationship, that could be on a quarterly basis. We're a big fan of what we refer to as QBRs, quarterly business reviews. And then systems for accountability, mostly designed through KPIs, key performance indicators. Okay, and then bring in the project to close once we feel that we're where we need to be in any relationship with a vendor or supplier. So when you ask the question, what characteristics makes for the perfect vendor? I'm not sure that there's ever a situation of the perfect vendor, but there are a lot of vendors that would probably on a 1 to 10 scale rise to that level of 8, 9, maybe 9.5 in looking at it metrically of how well they perform. If we get them to a 10, that's spectacular. But the key factors that we look at is our ability to develop an effective working relationship. It's not business to business. There's only names of the business. It's people who work for a company who interface with people who work for the other company. The services that are tacked onto it, because there might be a service portfolio that we're purchasing, or it might be a product that we're purchasing, but they're going to service our purchase of that product. Technology, as we all know, is becoming a much more increasingly important factor in how we have our relationships with vendors and suppliers. Are the vendor and suppliers state of the art? What payment terms are going to be offered? And through COVID, a lot more companies have actually extended, required the extension of their time to be paid. And in some verticals, it's actually decreased where people want to have a much tighter relationship in terms of getting paid. And then clearly one of the most important factors is price. What are we going to ultimately pay? And I put that at the bottom of the list because we really want to align these other things first: effective working relationships, service, technology, state-of-the-art, payment terms, and then fall into the price discussion. One of the things I'm going to make a point on relative to negotiating for price is that I try to bring price at the end of the conversation and not on the front side. Meaning I try to negotiate all the points that I want in the service portfolio or the nature of the product that we're buying, okay, to performance levels and so forth. And then once I do that, then I negotiate price. If in fact, and a point I'm going to make in a little while, is that if I properly spend enough time mining and benchmarking, okay, I should have a pretty good idea in a mining and benchmarking process to actually be able to determine what the range of price should be, meaning the high side of the pricing and what really should be potentially a low side. In most cases, I'm going to generally come somewhere in the middle once other factors are compromised. So the subject of effective working relationship is really when we like and respect who we're dealing with. And you think about that, of how many vendors or suppliers that you've interfaced with over the course of time that you just don't like. And generally, if you don't like them, and if the feelings mutually they don't like you, it's very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to have an effective working relationship. The vendor's capability, their credibility, and their capacity to service all your needs is another factor that impacts that effective working relationship. So when we choose a vendor, we're not only looking for the specific product or service that they have, but how are we going to grow in relationship with that company in the other areas that they may be able to provide us support in product purchasing or in services. That they understand the importance of compromise. And all through COVID, we've seen a lot of vendors and suppliers and also principal companies take a hard line on certain issues. And that's made it much more difficult in negotiating through this period of COVID. But as things start to relax, as we're already starting to see that happen now, okay, compromise is going to become a much more important factor again in the relationship between principals and their vendors and suppliers. In an effective working relationship, we also want to make sure that we have a party on the other side of the table that understands the importance of accommodation. And what we mean by that is we're always going to ask for favors. We're going to always ask for them to go above and beyond in the nature of that relationship. And we have to have somebody who's going to be able to do that for us, and not with a grimace, but with a smile. Accessibility is a critical issue, another factor that has come into the COVID problem over the last 2 years, where accessibility has been somewhat limited, particularly with people working from home, as to the extent that they have. So accessibility, generally, 5 days a week between 9 and 5 is the general term. But in the last 2 years, we all know that a lot more conversations have happened at 7, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, or 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, like no other time before. So accessibility means when you need to get to these people, they're responsive to you. which is the last line of them actually being responsive to whatever your needs and requirements are. And not in a sporadic basis, but on a consistent day-to-day basis as the relationship moves along. The area of customer service, we want them to be friendly. We want them to be contemporary in how they approach customer service. Contemporary today means not just the conversation that takes place over the phone, but texting is used, emails are used, Instagram is used in some cases, Twitter is used in the means of communicating to it. So finding whatever works between the two parties and using that medium for the purpose of communication and being contemporary. Responding timely, responding comprehensively, responding transparently, being responsible, reliable, and responsive. 3 R's that we have in customer care service. Again, being responsible, reliable, and responsive on a consistent basis. And adjusts and accommodates easily. When we ask for a favor, when we ask for something to be done, when we ask for a modification, that they ease into it and very happy to help serve us as compared to it being a struggle. If we have to pick up the phone and ask them something and we're in fear of making that phone call, okay, that shouldn't be the case. We should easily be able to pick up the phone or send the communication in and ask what we need for, and it be accommodated when possible. You want technology in all relationships is becoming obviously more increasingly important, but you want technology that adds value, that offers differentiation from other suppliers and vendors. You want a technology that helps you in one of your primary supply chain responsibilities to help reduce risk and cost in your organization. You want technology that adds better business process. You want technology that's state of the art. And that's not easy to do because a lot of people who do technology purchasing and people who sell technology will tell you that when the sale is made and the purchase is acquired, okay, that already the technology may be outdated. So trying to stay on top of that is a very difficult thing. So building into technology purchases, making sure that the updates and the upgrades become part of the deal. And you want a technology that provides complete integration so that there's a seamless relationship between your organization and theirs. State of the art, that they can solve current problems. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic put a whole new array of problems in vendor and client relationships. Okay, did they hide behind their emails, or were they upfront with the problems transparently and trying to work with you to resolve them? You know, one of the good things about a disaster is you get a pretty good idea of the level of performance. When everything's going right, everybody can perform pretty well. But it's really, when it's difficult, is really the true measure of how well a vendor or supplier or a relationship will perform. That they bring contemporary and futuristic solutions to the table. That they combine technology with the delivery of all their services. And that they continually work to create value in the relationship. And they view the relationship as you should view the relationship, particularly in that tier 1 supplier group, that it's a partnership. We're both parties working to your mutual benefit. Payment terms, another issue, another thing impacted by COVID in both directions, where some companies needed to be paid very quickly and other companies were very flexible in extending terms. So flexibility is a key word here, providing options on how you pay, paying more timely and getting a benefit for that. We just negotiated a deal in $1.5 million spend for a technology service. And upon presentation of the PO, the payment would be made that same day. And we were able to get a 6% discount off the price with the PO being paid on that same day. Some companies need longer terms. They need as much as 60 or 90 days in order to pay, and the vendor supplier works with you in that capacity. And basically, at the end of the day, they accommodate whatever your needs are and their willingness to do that and find a solution where there may be some compromise involved. Price, which obviously is a very important driving factor in all decisions related to vendors and suppliers. Again, the point that I make relative to this is I try to get all those other things that we just listed and talked about. If I properly benchmark the price, I should have a pretty good idea where it should come in. So I bring it into the last point in the negotiation. And what I'm really striving for is what I've highlighted on this screen is really obtaining the best value for your spend. I don't want the cheapest. I don't want the least expensive. What I want in my mindset and what I'm willing to negotiate with is getting the best value for your spend. If I strive to get the lowest price, there's usually some level of negative consequences when I do that, meaning that there's some trade-offs in the service portfolio or the performance or the quality when that is put forth. And again, I'm going to emphasize in the concept of negotiation that if we benchmark, okay, on a timely basis, okay, we should have a pretty good idea what the price range should be in any transaction that we're negotiating with a vendor or supplier.
Tom, I have one question that just came in. It's from Sherry. She said, in my past experience, I tried to follow these types of suggestions, but found that management did not always agree. Any thoughts on the best way to handle those types of conflicts?
Yeah, I mean, in general management and leadership discussions, we talk about a person, particularly in purchasing and supply chain, that you're in the middle of the company. And at the end of the day, you have to manage in 4 different directions. You have to manage down, which is to subordinates who may work for you or work under you. You have to manage in, which are to the stakeholders in your company. Generally, they hold comparable positions. Some may be senior or junior. We have to manage out, and that's generally to the vendors and suppliers that we're dealing with. But we also have to manage up. Manage up means that at various points in time, you need to have conversations with your senior management team, and you have to create a compelling argument, okay, and a compelling position as to why that the best value for your spend is really the option that you're looking for and not necessarily the best price. With examples that you can give relative to when a price was fought hard for and you got the cheapest price, but 6 months later, that particular vendor wasn't performing, or the quality of their product didn't work out for you, or the level of service that was promised wasn't there, as compared to those where you negotiated to the best value for your spend, which now has created sustainable relationships. So managing up is the ability for you to be able to sit down with management and tell them your theory of and your management style of and how you're going to approach these types of negotiations to get their buy-in. And as we all know, you might have some degree of success with that effort. If you have a more open-minded and reasonable management team, you'll find success in that discussion. If you have ones that are a little bit more obstinate, okay, and single-minded, you might not be successful in that. And therefore, at that point in time, you have to make a decision whether you're going to acquiesce to what they want, which may not be the way you feel it should be done, but that's the way you've got to do it, or move on. Okay, and that's really at the end of the day, the options. So in vendor management, what we are primarily negotiating for are really 2 categories: price and services. In the services category, I put in, if we're buying a product, the quality and the performance and so forth of that product. So in a relationship that we already have with an existing vendor, or maybe a relationship with somebody who's knocking at our door, who wants to come into the bidding process or knows that we're going to open up the bidding process at some point, is when do we begin that negotiation? My response is this, is that you should be negotiating from the very first conversation that you have all the way through to the last conversation that you have. Okay, and that means you're negotiating every day, as much as a year in advance, in every meeting and every discussion. Because what you should be negotiating is mining and benchmarking as part of that price. So you should be asking questions all the time. As an example, in a existing vendor relationship, and let's say you've got 4 months to go to renewal of that contract, you could start to get a sense and feel what they're going to approach you with. Are they going to increase their pricing? Are they going to limit the amount of volume that they're shipping to you? Are they going to change the terms of sale or the terms of payment? Okay, by asking questions. So you're already in the negotiation process by asking those questions, so that when you get to the point that you need to negotiate, you have a pretty good idea of what position that they're going to take. And if you have a new vendor or supplier soliciting of you, that's where you start to have the conversation preliminarily as to, where are you in the range of pricing? Where are you in the range of payment terms? Where are you in the range of contractual concessions and things that you're looking for in a relationship? Okay. The negotiation starts from that very first meeting and it continues through the entire relationship every day, because you're constantly fielding information that you're going to be used to help make a better, more informed decision. When do we begin that negotiation? 3 critical points. Establish that dialogue from the very beginning in a more formal way with matured vendors and suppliers during monthly or quarterly meetings. You'll hear me use the term quarterly business reviews. And certainly as a minimum amount, again, we're talking about those tier 1 suppliers. We're talking about those where we have 80% of our spend and 20% of our vendor suppliers. You have a critical time frame that's diary 3 to 4 months out from renewal. We get called in on a lot of our clients and sometimes new clients where, particularly towards the end of the year, that here it is December 15th and they've got something expiring on December 31st that they need help with in negotiating closure. Obviously we'll take on that responsibility and do the best that we can, but we ask the question, why wasn't this started, on September 15th? And a lot of times people get too busy, something slips between the cracks, okay? Or they're just not as comprehensively being on top of the things that they really should be. But as a guideline for tier 1 suppliers where that big spend is being made, minimally 3 to 4 months out, you've got to start that conversation so that when the renewal occurs, you'll be prepared for it in advance. Mining, sensing, and measuring is a critical aspect. It allows us to be better informed. If we're constantly digging for information and finding out what options exist, okay, it gives us better information so we can make better decisions. Learn about the other side of the table. When I mentioned it earlier about there's a partnership here and you have to be sensitive to what their needs are. That should be questions that you ask in any existing vendor relationship as well as a new vendor relationship, is what's important to them in the relationship. What would they like to see you change to make for a more effective working relationship? What is it important to them in having you as a client? And therefore you be able to understand that, be able to manage the relationship with them better. In the military, which I come out of, in a combat situation, we send in salvos. And the best way to visualize that is if you're on a field in a confrontation with the other side and you can't see them, but they're out there. But a lot of times mortar fire would be dropped at various spots out in the field. And, all of a sudden one of the mortars will hit and you'll see something blow up because you may have hit an ammunition dump. Okay. So salvos are sending out, these mortars in combat to figure out where the enemy is. Okay. The same concept can be utilized in trying to figure out where a vendor or supplier is. Existing vendor, 6 months before renewal. We have 6 months before the renewal, Mr. or Mrs. ABC, and can you tell me what your position is going to be come that renewal? What are you guys thinking about? So forth. So that if they're coming across with a major price increase and they explain to you why, well, you can negotiate the reason why. Maybe you can or you can't, but at least you know that that's coming. So then you know what steps to take. It may be time to bring in other vendors and suppliers in a bidding process if this company is going to come along, possibly reasonably or possibly unreasonably, right? That's part of the assessment that we have to take. But if we only wait to the very end to find out about that potential price increase, we could be stuck because we haven't reached out to enough companies as a better or more lucrative option. And that's not a negative thing. It's a positive skill set. The ability to reach out ahead of time and get information that's going to be more valuable in that negotiation process with a vendor or supplier. We focus on 6 areas in the negotiation with vendors, and we call it a process, which means there are steps involved. And if we consistently follow those steps, it gives us the best opportunity to succeed. So the first is preparing, the second is mining, third is vetting, the fourth is creating leverage points, the fifth is bringing favorable closure, and the sixth is creating a win-win scenario. So let's talk about these 6 areas. Negotiating as a process with a vendor is not getting just what you want. It is setting the deal up so both sides gain from the agreement. Too often, procurement, supply chain people will negotiate with the concept of this is what I need to get. And that might be dictated by management, or it might be dictated by your own sensibilities, or it might be dictated by the needs of your company. But if you negotiate with that mindset and only that mindset, you're more likely to fail as compared to negotiating where I need to get here, but let me find out from the other side where they need to be to see where a compromise or where we need to be in that negotiation and how I'm going to strategically and tactically approach that circumstance. So the mindset that's changing here is that I do need to be concerned with what they're looking for on the other side of the table, and how do they justify it? What are their reasons? So it allows me to be better prepared on how I'm going to react to that. Because in some cases, they might create very credible, responsible arguments that maybe we haven't thought about, okay? Or on the other side of that equation, maybe they're just being greedy. Maybe, in fact, they're taking advantage of circumstances, okay? Which would then change how we might approach that relationship in that negotiation process. If you buy into that concept, as I just discussed, you strategize the negotiation, you must bring the other side of the tables, their needs, their wants, and their requirements. Requirements is an interesting word because requirements mean what do they need? The better way of phrasing that more comprehensively in this case is that asking the vendor, what can we do to make your job easier with us, and therefore maybe get to the price that we're looking for, because it would be less costly for you to handle our business. Okay, and it might be upgrading technology. It might be how things are transferred between the companies. Okay, it might be slight ways in how deliveries are being made. I mean, there's so many factors to the supply chain that the adjustment could be made on your side, making it easier for them and therefore helping to bring the cost down. But it starts out with the mindset that you're going to work with them in finding a mutual resolve, that both parties will win in the negotiation. In preparing, remember, we're supporting stakeholders in our companies for the most part that are using these various services. So we need internal collaborative needs and requirements. We need to know what's going on in our own organization so that we know what we have to negotiate for, what things have changed, okay, where have there been problems, questions like that, and feeding that into the discussion. We need to set reasonable goals. I have over to the left side there. goal setting and the terminology SMART, which many of you probably have heard, but it really has some merit, which is all goals need to be very specific. They need to be measurable. They have to be attainable. Okay, they have to be relevant, and those four are very critical: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant. And I don't think anybody could argue in trying to set a goal that those four factors are critical. And the last one is time bound, meaning that a goal has to have a beginning and an end. Okay, when do we expect something to work or to happen? So these are all issues involved in goal setting. Clearly defined expectations and deliverables. What are we actually looking for? And getting down to very hard definitions and line items of what we need. If we're going to bring the business out to bid, it's our responsibility to let the incumbent know that. In a true partnership and relationship, that's a good practice. We also let to know the potential bidders that we have a favored incumbent or we have an unfavored incumbent, and who else is involved in the bidding process. Transparency is critical here. And we need to create a project plan and a timeline, meaning taking all those expectations and building them out over a period of time from the beginning of the negotiation, the process, all the way to when it brings closure. And the minimum amount of time in that tier 1 suppliers is 3 to 4 months. It'd be preferable to bring it to 6 months and even to a year in advance when possible. The mining aspect of the preparation for negotiation. Information is gold. The more informed that we are, the ability to make better decisions follows. Create an information flow that is likely to be very useful. Discover and understand your options. Develop a due diligent and reasonable care approach to your supply chain and procurement management responsibilities. The vetting, not only of new vendors, but also the vetting and the continuation of scrutinizing existing incumbent vendors. It's process driven to determine who will participate, meaning what companies are you going to bring in. It continues on the negotiation process. The vetting creates a mutual path for both sides to evaluate the potential relationship. One of the things that becomes critical in that tier 1 category is you want to make sure that you're a good fit for them. You might be dealing with a very zealous salesperson who's just looking to acquire business, but at the end of the day, it may not make sense, not from your side, but from their side. You don't want to have a relationship entered and create a whole implementation strategy, bring a vendor on if it's not going to work out for them. We talk about the funnel concept, meaning that there's a whole slew of vendors at the top of that funnel, and the vetting process brings us down to a smaller amount and eventually to one, moving many to a few. Creating leverage points. We can do that when we understand what the other side wants. If the other side is taking a position, we don't want to lose your account. It's very important to us. Or we want your account very badly because we're entering this vertical. Well, that gives you leverage knowing those things, that you have a company that's really looking to maintain their business with you or really looking to do business with you. That gives you a certain advantage in the negotiation. You need to determine your strengths. A lot of companies and people use the SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in determining best strategies for negotiation. And you always want to try to create a strategy from where the strength side and what advantages you have in that discussion. In the COVID issue, that idea of strength has actually been decimated because it hardly existed. Just like just-in-time inventory has gone away the last 2 years, and it's probably going to be still out for another 2 years or so. Okay, our ability to really leverage ourselves in today's COVID world is a lot more difficult than it was pre-COVID. And be careful to balance your approach. Okay, You don't want to come off too aggressive, okay, or too highly leveraged in any negotiation. Eventually, you want to bring closure, and we know that generally in a higher level tier one negotiation, compromise is likely to happen. Should be viewed not as a closing, but an opening, meaning that not a closure to a circumstance, but now opening of a new opportunity or an opportunity to continue a relationship. It ultimately leads to an agreement and understanding, a statement of work and or a contract. One of the things that we always mention to you is that if you have a standard agreement or a statement of work, put that out up front so that their attorneys or their key people can review that ahead of time, so you don't run into a problem with the contract when you're trying to close the deal. Closure moves everything into implementation, bringing a new vendor in or reestablish your relationship with an existing vendor. And again, moves into a project plan and a timeline, but that whole implementation becomes a project all in itself. Creating the win-win is an important mindset in negotiating. And when the other side believes that that's what you're working towards, you'll find a much greater willingness for them to negotiate with you when they think that you're and perceive that you are protecting their interests as much as your own, and that you're trying to create a situation where both parties are going to win in this scenario. I hold that you compromise on everything, but not your principles, and principles established on a personal level as well as business level. Make sure your goals, expectations, and deliverables have been met on both sides. So if you know the things that they were looking for, that's a question you want to ask, is say, as we're coming to close on this agreement, are the things that you wanted, have you achieved that? And don't assume that, ask them. And then that's now the time to break bread or have a drink. Obviously, the last 2 years, COVID, almost everything has been done virtually, okay? But the good news is we're coming out of that, and there's more face-to-face meetings, and our ability to break bread and have a drink with somebody is something that helps further and deepen the relationship between principals, vendors, and their suppliers. So preparing, mining, vetting, creating leverage points, bringing favorable close, creating a win. We just did a project a few months ago for a New York-based insurance company for office cleaning services. This company has 9 offices in the 5 boroughs of New York, and they spend about $1.5 million on cleaning services. And that price escalated to over $2 million because of COVID, because of all the new protocols involved in keeping the offices clean and so forth. Because of the nature of the insurances that they sell, they were considered an essential business. So a lot of people still were maintained in the office, though some of the people could work from home. In preparing for this negotiation, we put their existing vendor on notice that in 6 months we were going to be renewing this agreement, and we were going to bring in some other companies to bid. We have spoken to in that time frame 5 other companies that had the capacity to handle that many offices in all 5 boroughs, and we started the conversation with them and sharing, here's what we're looking for, and we'd like to get an idea from you of range of pricing. So early on, we were able to get a sense and feel where these companies were coming in, so we could kind of create a range of what we thought might be the low end and the high end of pricing. Obviously, we knew what we were already paying. We then started the process of vetting those companies by having a couple of virtual meetings. Then we had some on-site meetings. Okay. In the vetting process, we asked exactly how they execute their responsibilities and how they're making sure that the offices are clean and also meeting the basic protocols related to COVID. So through that vetting process, we went from I think 6 or 7 companies down to 2. We were keeping the incumbent against one other company. And it was only at that point in the negotiation that we start to bring price into the equation. Okay. We ended up maintaining the relationship with the existing vendor. We got a new pricing structure for them, which was about 20% better than it had been in previous years. As part of our negotiating strategy, we're adding a 10th office, which was going to be the new corporate office for this company. And we said to them that we would automatically give them that contract as part of our commitment in the relationship. So that was going to add another $200,000 to $250,000 of billing for them. So at the end of the day, we created a win-win with this particular incumbent, where we got them more business, and in turn, we were able to get a better price. And we also raised the bar of some of the performance levels, because of the insurance agency had gotten so busy, they were actually working on Saturdays, where previously it was only Monday to Friday. So we had to add in an extra day of cleaning at the end of the day on Saturday, which they were able to accommodate, and they're getting extra money for that additional service. So managing existing vendors, some of the things we want to look at is KPIs, obviously key performance indicators, stewardship reports, how am I doing, quarterly business reviews, particularly in matured relationships, service meetings, and creating that atmosphere that's open, direct, and transparent dialogue. I created a list of various KPIs as examples for you to look at. That's on the left here for order management, supply, inventory, distribution, and transportation management. The key to setting KPIs, as I've outlined here, is to look at the specific needs that your company has, that your stakeholders internally need, and create KPIs that conform to them. At the end of this presentation is my email address. I have a whole white paper that we prepared several years ago, and we've upgraded it just recently. You're all welcome to reach into me to get a copy of that paper, and it outlines in about 17, 18 pages a really much more detailed, extensive listing of what KPIs should companies be using in measuring the performance of their vendors or suppliers. Some KPI do not make up new standards. Learn about your industry KPIs and focus on them first. Do not develop measures without getting buy-in from the staff. Do not make your KPIs intangible. Regularly review them and make adjustments, meaning it's a moving target. Do not make your KPI static. Raise the benchmarks once you meet or exceed them. And do not shoot or merely meeting minimums for all KPIs. Instead, strive to reach the minimum acceptable performance levels. KPIs, numbers are quantitative. Always appreciate that. That's what senior management is looking for. Numbers don't lie. Determine what you will need to measure the performance, collaborative assessments, involve all the stakeholders, create a measurement grid, and periodically review. Area of stewardship reports and quarterly business reviews. There are mandatory reports by vendor designed by you, KPI reviews, review of action items from last report, new issues, bring in the stakeholders. Stakeholders like to be involved in the meetings where you're holding vendors and suppliers to a standard, okay? And you're creating from that meeting a new action plan and a revisit date. For generally matured vendors, quarterly reviews is more than sufficient. Service meetings, not as formal as a stewardship, weekly, monthly calls on specific items, quarterly business reviews, creates a collaborative and an accountable relationship. Open, direct, and transparent dialogue. This is creating a culture on how you would interface with the world. In management, supply chain, procurement creates a path to better results. Learn how to be confrontational without necessarily being over aggressive, antagonistic, or belligerent. Request it from all you interface with. It reduces and eliminates nuances, bad behaviors, BS, rhetoric, and lying, and is the best way of establishing trust between a principal and a vendor and a supplier. Accountability, people and businesses rise to the level you hold them accountable. And that's one of the reasons in existing relationships you prevent against complacency by having steps and actions in place to keep holding them accountable for their performance and having them continually raise the bar of the level of performance, the services offered, or the nature of how the relationship exists. In managing existing relationships with vendors, we have ones that are really good relationships, ones that are horrible, ones that might be in between, and then we have the last category, which is the vendor you despise but cannot change. So giving you some thoughts on the great vendor, show appreciation. Okay, if you have a really good vendor, take them out to lunch, take them out to dinner. Now, I know we couldn't do that in the last 2 years, but we can do that now. Keep them from being complacent, keeping accountability systems in place, even in the best of relationships. Always keep options open, as you never know. Things can change overnight. Somebody buys somebody else. The person who is your key contact is gone. Okay, these things happen all the time. Expand them into other business areas of your company. If you got a good relationship and they provide other services and they could expand their relationship into your company, help them accommodate that. And provide them remuneration against the value, which means that if they're providing a higher level of value in the relationship, perhaps maybe more money can be offered. You have a horrible vendor. The first thing you have to do is determine if they're worth saving, because maybe they're not. You need to confront the problem. Depending upon how they respond is how your response is going to be. But you ultimately need to agree on a corrective action plan and timeline for behavior modification. If they're truly horrible, that's going to be a short fuse. If you save them, you got to watch them closely that they don't, go back to the bad behavior. And you want to amp up the due diligence and the reasonable care in managing the relationship with a horrible vendor. The in-between vendor, again, determine if they're worth saving, confront the problem, respond depending upon their response, agree on attack, corrective action, and timeline for behavior. If saved, watch closely, and again, amp up the due diligence. An in-between vendor, to me, is no different than a horrible vendor. And then the vendor you despise. The vendor you despise but cannot change. We get a lot of these cases into our office where a company says, we're really struggling here trying to replace this vendor. We can't stand them. They're the only people who do what they do and so forth. And the first thing that we've learned in doing this for more than 30 years is don't believe that myth. It's a myth. There's only one company that does this thing. The world is too big for that to be true. There may be less players in a particular area, but there's generally not just one. And consistently, we've broken that myth. If you turn enough stones over and you create enough outreach, you can generally find options. If there really is a relationship that you despise, then replace it as soon as you can, because it's not going to get better. I make the point all the time. It will never get better doing nothing, because doing nothing is an action which will produce nothing. RFPs is a tool that we use in vendor selection and management. And again, could be a subject for another whole seminar for an hour, webinar for an hour. So why do we use an RFP? Because maybe we're forced to by internal controls at certain levels to put it out to bid. Lots of companies have rules that over a certain amount of spend, every so many years, we have to put it out to bid. We may want to test the marketplace because we want to threaten our current vendor or supplier. We want to, hold them accountable by telling them that we're bringing other companies into bid and actually making that happen. Or maybe we want an RFP because we really intend to make a change. We're not satisfied with the vendor or supplier that we're using. We've tried all kinds of measures to change the relationship. It hasn't worked. So it's time to make a change. So RFP can be used in any one of these samples. Our methodology for RFPs works around the concept of taking price out of the RFP process to the very end of the negotiation. The methodology believes that potential vendors and suppliers would prefer to propose offerings where their quality and capability leads the discussion and not price. My experience being on both sides of the table, selling and procuring, which I do sit on both sides of the table, there'll be trade-offs if price is at the front end of the conversation. There'll be impact on quality if price is at the front end of the conversation. Impacts capability and the service portfolio negatively if price is on the equation. If you walked into a car dealership and you said to him, I got $37,500 to spend on this Mercedes 320L, okay? And that's the bottom line of that car, okay? That's what you're gonna get is the bottom line of that car versus walking in there, looking for your car and then negotiating the price once you found the car that you want. I don't want to downplay the importance of price in the conversation because we know it's extremely important, okay? It's the timing of when we bring that into the equation. And it's at the end of the negotiation, not the beginning. The methodology believes that in purchasing, supply chain, overall management, what we want is not the cheapest, but the best value for our spend. It impacts quality, scope of services, and ultimately performance. Price is critical, but it cannot drive the RFP process. So what drives the negotiation first are the deliverables, then followed by price. We highly recommend anybody in purchasing and sourcing and vendor management and supply chain, take a negotiations class, take an RFP management class, and change your mindset, behavior, and actions in how you deal with your vendor. Take an interest in what their needs are and what they are looking for. Always keep in mind the negotiation process is an ongoing activity in every conversation that you have with them, every interchange. Mining and benchmarking are continually occurring. If you utilize a specific SOW, statement of work, a master services agreement, the contract format, identify it up front. Spend between 7 to 10% of your time monthly in seeing potential vendors and suppliers in that tier 1 category. You know, in a 40-hour work week, okay, that's about 3 to 4 hours. Okay. Most of us are working more than that, so it could be as much as 5 to 6 hours. It's a lot of time, but the bottom line of mining and benchmarking is that time is well spent. Attend industry trade shows where in a concentration of 2 or 3 days, you can see a lot of different companies as potential vendors or suppliers. Network with other supply chain and procurement personnel. That's obviously one of the benefits of ISM. From other companies, their advice, contacts, and resources come in very handy. Remember, quantitative will always trump qualitative and what does senior management ultimately want. And lastly, tier your suppliers and create that tier 1 supplier base. So I went over just a little bit, but I would take any questions that anybody would have. I appreciate your attention and appreciate you listening in.
Well, thank you so much. That was actually a very comprehensive presentation. Thank you for sharing that with us today. Just one question. When do you think the COVID issues in the supply chain might be more normal?
Good question. We update a predictive report that we put out to our client base every 3 months. So the last report was generated at the end of December. We're getting one now ready to prepare for the end of March. And they're very close to saying that same thing, which is that we don't expect the supply chain in terms of delays and costs to dissipate until after the first quarter of 2023. We believe that we'll start to see signs of improvement in August, September of this year, but the residual impact isn't going to be seen until the end of the first quarter as we get to the second quarter of 2023. There's almost a 7 to 8 month lag between when demand is reduced in the supply chain and the capacity can catch up. So right now, demand is still continuing to increase, but all the indicators are that it will start to slow down come August, September. And then you have that residual impact, which will bring us into the end of the first quarter, into the beginning of the second quarter. That's our prediction, and we're going to put something out again towards the end of March. It's going to talk about the same thing.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank you for the presentation today. As I said, very comprehensive. We will be sending everybody the slides in addition to the recording, and also continuing education hour for joining us today. I would like to say that our next Lunch and Learn is going to be on April 13th. That one's going to be on software contracts, the key issues. So that'll be a very important topic. And then the membership meeting is going to be on April 20th. They are doing their, Rochester will be doing their elections that particular night. So we hope you can join us for that one as well. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, Tom, for bringing this great topic to the Rochester chapter. We do appreciate your time and all the effort that you put in to all your presentations. So this time I'll close out the program and wish everybody a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.